Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dead to Rights, the podcast. I'm your host, Ted Carrick. Happy Canada Day to all our friends north of the 49th, and we also want to send good July 4th wishes to our American cousins. Whichever side of the Peace Bridge you find yourself on, we wish you peace and joy throughout the coming year. Today marks a milestone episode for Dead to Rights. Our weekly listeners will know that every week since December 29th of 2017, we've brought you short story readings for our readers on the run, author and book industry interviews, insights, and tips for writers, as well as reviews of books, movies, and other works of popular culture. Each week, we also touch briefly on the current news and events, adding our voice to the history we see unfolding around us. Today, we unfurl our maple leaf in honor of Canada's birthday. We also celebrate our 17th weekly episode, a full half year of fantastic book and book industry news, chats, and information. It's been our pleasure to produce this podcast for you, to reach out to readers and authors in our community. We hope you'll stay with us for the next 26 episodes as we unwrap the balance of 2018. Coming up in July, we have a number of fantastic authors on the agenda. On July 8th, we'll be speaking with Iris Weichler, author of the self-help book Role Reversal. Then, on July 15th, we'll bring you the very funny comic author Perry Block, Nouveau Old, Formerly Cute. On July 22nd, we'll speak with Jane Barnard, author of The Falls Mysteries and the Maddie Hatter Adventures. And then, on July 29th, to wrap up the month, we're thrilled to talk books with Jen Knox, an exceptional literary author of The Glass City and After the Gazebo. I highly recommend her works. Today, appropriately for our Canada Day episode, we're featuring Canadian author George Mercer, a former Canadian Parks warden who is intimately familiar with the inner beauty of our country. George will talk to us about his Dyed in the Green mystery series, and if you happen to hear a bird song in the background in this podcast, I apologize if you consider it noise, but it's very, very hot in the North Country today, as many of you will know. We're suffering a major heat wave for Canada Day, and I've got to have the windows open. Today on our Readers on the Run segment, and in honor of this auspicious day, we'll feature an ode to freedom and independence for nations and for the individuals who comprise them. Our reading will be Spartacus the Kite by Ted Carrick. But before we get there, I've got a few news items to highlight our industry. First, I want to bring your attention to a brand new literary gem by well-known Canadian author Caro Souls, titled People Like Us. It will be on my review list in the near future. Also, by sci-fi thriller author Stephen M. Moore, check out his title Soldiers of God. Not only is it highly relevant today, but it also provides a fantastic segue between his earlier Clones and Mutants series and his more recent The Chaos Chronicles. I want to tell you about something Carrick Publishing has been working on throughout June. 3 fantastic titles by Canadian crime writer Rosemary McCracken that make up the Pat Tierney Mystery Series are being re-released this week by Carrick Publishing. Safe Harbor, Blackwater, and Raven Lake are all soon to be available under the Carrick cover. If you're already familiar with McCracken's work, then get your hands on a copy of Book 3, Raven Lake. You won't be disappointed. If you don't yet know Rosemary's work, I recommend you read them all. Financial crime is the theme, and it's one we're all fascinated with these days. As you know from last week's episode, I'm currently reading the latest work of Mr. Stephen King, The Outsider. I'm not quite ready to review it, but by next week, I'll be ready to bring you my ideas on this fantastic book. For now, I can tell you it's well worth the price of purchase. What makes King's books so special? That's a question many authors would love to resolve, a mystery we would love to reveal. In our early days as writers, we seek the Holy Grail, the one true method that will grab our readers by the throat and force them to turn those pages. When I review The Outsider next week, I'll take a stab at the elements that make his work both accessible and addictive. For now, though, I refer our listeners to On Writing by Stephen King, said to be one of the best, most accessible resources for new writers to be had. Incidentally, I've added On Writing to my Audible library, and I'll give you my insights on it as well once it rolls up on my to-be-listened-to list. It was a tough week for society in general, and for journalists in particular. On Friday, June 29th, a 38-year-old Maryland suspect opened fire in the offices of the Capital Gazette, killing 4 journalists and 1 staffer. I won't dignify this evil man with a mention of his name, but I would like to take a moment to honor the 5 killed and their families and surviving colleagues. The following comments are directly quoted from CNN and can be attributed to them. I repeat them here with full credit as a tribute to these fallen folks. Rob Hyacinth walked into the newsroom of the Capital Gazette newspaper convinced that his community had the right to know the news. He had a unique way of telling stories and enjoyed mentoring young reporters. Gerald Fishman, 61, had been at the newspaper for more than 25 years. The editorial page editor was known to have a quiet and reserved personality, but his work and knowledge charmed many. John McNamara had worked at the Capital Gazette in various capacities for more than 20 years. The 56-year-old loved covering sports, and his interest in local history inspired him to write 2 books about the University of Maryland's football and basketball history. Rebecca Smith, 34, joined the newspaper last year as a sales assistant. She was a very thoughtful person, Marty Padden, the newspaper's advertising director, told the Baltimore Sun. She was kind and considerate and willing to help when needed. Wendy Winters was an editor and community reporter for the Capital Gazette, writing several weekly columns. The 65-year-old moved to Maryland after working for 2 public relation agencies in New York and owning her own boutique agency in the Big Apple, her staff bio said. Again, I must reiterate, full credit for these comments goes to CNN. I've merely repeated the comments here because it is the victims of these monsters and their families who deserve our respect and who merit a place in our collective memories. And now, in honor of freedom and independence for Canada Day and the U.S. Independence Day, I bring you Spartacus the Kite by Ted Carrick. I made it. I'm free. I can't believe it. It's so great. I can hear them talking below me. They think this is a tragedy and it's making them sad. They suspect the tree was lurking to ensnare me. They couldn't be more wrong. I saw my opportunity and I took it. The lady's concentration wavered for a second, and I leapt on a surging updraft into the arms of these branches. Then she pulled too hard and my chains broke. Now I'm sitting pretty, way up in the sky, looking out over the bay, open air in almost all directions. They're still talking about what they can do to rescue me. The man says he might climb the tree. That's a laugh. He'll get halfway up, then drop like a stone. I don't really want to see that. I don't know these people, but they seem decent enough, and I have no reason to be cruel. The little one says they should send squirrels up to get me. That's actually pretty good as jokes go. Nobody in my immediate family has ever been free before. I had a distant relative who once had his cord break, and he disappeared over a bank of hills. Nobody ever heard from him again. There were rumors that he later found success in life as a lookout for migrating whooping cranes, but that's only family folklore. More likely he got fried when tied up to a lightning rod. That's the threat kite parents use on their children when they want them to behave. I'm also the first kite in my family to go to university, majoring in history. That's where I learned that there's more to life than just being kept on a string. Sure, it's nice to soar heavenward on a strong breeze, but then you get yanked from side to side, and you're brought back down to earth long before you've had enough. Now I'm positioned here, high in my lookout. My wings are spread wide, and my tail is bobbing in the breeze. It's true, I won't be able to go anywhere, but sometimes you've got to give up a little to gain a lot. Below me, I can see they're finally giving up and moving away. There's some talk about coming back tomorrow or a week from now or even in a month or two to see if they can get me back. They can forget it. I'm never coming down. I'm hoping that what I've done will set an example for others of my kind. Maybe my actions will start a popular movement in the kite community. Proudly, I go by the name of Spartacus. Now, if I can only find a mate. Thank you for listening to Spartacus the Kite by Ted Carrick. I hope you've enjoyed today's Readers on the Run story as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you. And now for our special Canada Day episode, I'm thrilled to bring you our Dead to Rights interview with Canadian author and former Parks Warden, George Mercer. Award-winning author of the Died in the Green series, the first fiction series about Canada's iconic national parks, George worked for more than 3 decades as a park warden, including 6 national parks on both the east and west coasts, the North and the Rocky Mountains. George's passion for parks and protected areas forms the backdrop for much of his writing, including both creative nonfiction and fiction, found at his website, as well as nonfiction found at writenature.com. Stay with us as we reach out to George.
Good morning, Donna.
Good morning, George. Welcome to Dead to Rights. How are you today?
Hey, good. Very good. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. George.
Thanks for adjusting the time.
Oh, you're quite welcome. You're quite welcome. And in honor of the fact that you worked for so long, 3 decades as a park warden in Canada in the national parks, we're going to actually air this on Canada Day weekend. So just keep that in mind as we're talking, because I thought that would be a really good slot for you. For our listeners, George Mercer is the award-winning author of the Died in the Green series, the first fiction series about Canada's iconic national parks. And as someone who grew up spending almost every summer in those parks, I really applaud you for bringing them to readers.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it, and I guess my main thing is to try and use my fiction to try and attract readers to stories about our national parks that they might not otherwise read.
Can you tell us about a couple of the parks that you've worked in that really have stayed in your mind?
Well, they all have, quite honestly. We've worked in 6, but started in Terra Nova in Newfoundland, and then moved to Fundy, New Brunswick, and then Cape Breton, and then following to Wood Buffalo and Jasper, and now to the Gulf Islands. But Wood Buffalo, I would have to say, is one that's been was a really powerful place for working in that. Some really challenging issues there, and really neat to work in Canada's north. And Jasper, also being sort of an iconic Rocky Mountain National Park, was also
the sheer beauty. You mentioned also Fundy. That's where my peeps are from. So I'm very familiar with that park. Yeah.
Yeah. So Fundy was also sort of the first park I had permanent work in, and that. And the series actually are all based on parks that I worked in. So only writing about national parks that I've actually got good knowledge about, know the landscape and the marine areas, and try and embed that as much as possible into the story so readers get a good sense of place.
Yes, I noticed that when I was actually doing a little research. And for our listeners, you can find George at georgemercer.com. And when I was online taking a look at your work, I noticed that they really are all set in these places. Tell us about a couple of your titles. For example, Died in the Green.
Well, Died in the Green Green is actually, so it's the title book in the series and also the name of the series itself. And it basically comes from an expression that an older chief park warden used out in Atlantic Canada. And he was talking about the commitment that parks people have to working in national parks and people who work in protected areas in general, saying they aren't really dyed in the wool, they're dyed in the green. That they're, they're um, so committed to working on things with respect to the environment and protected areas that they're literally dyed in the green.
Mm-hmm. And your national park warden is Ben Matthews, and he's in the Cape Breton Highlands, which is just absolutely stunning country. And he is facing a notorious poacher with a reputation for letting nothing get in his way. Can you tell us any more about that story? I know it's set along the Cabot Trail, which is just, again, gorgeous countryside for anyone who has not done the Cabot Trail. I really do recommend it.
Yeah, so the two main characters, park wardens, are Ben Matthews and Kay Jones, and as soon as they get into Cape Breton, actually they run into a fairly notorious poacher, John Donald Moores, and one of the big challenges is that not only is the poaching of salmon and deer rampant in the park, but there's also the challenge of dealing with sort of the overall acceptance within the local community of poaching as sort of part of their way of life. So Ben and Kate are sort of up against not only the poaching itself, but the attitudes about it. But as they make headway dealing with some of the characters in this story, they actually help to turn the tide within the community. And I won't give away the main thing, but other events help turn the tide in the community to sort of sway more of the community attitude towards the need for protection of the national park.
And another title in this series is Wood Buffalo. And that would have been the one that you were telling me about in the outset of our talk, where Ben Matthews is actually in, now he goes from the Cape Breton Highlands to Wood Buffalo. And where exactly is Wood Buffalo?
So, excuse me, Wood Buffalo is actually Canada's largest national park, and it's actually the second largest in the world, but it's so it straddles the border between northern Alberta and the Northwest Territories. So basically approximately from the community of Fort Chipewyan in Alberta into across the border Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories and almost to the edges of Great Slave Lake. So it's a large national park mainly set aside to protect bison, but also it has the world's only sort of migrating population of endangered whooping cranes, and it has the largest inland freshwater delta in Canada, one of the largest in the world. So it's a very ecologically and culturally rich national park.
And not one that most general tourists would ever make their way to. Great Slave Lake is really up there, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're getting into, actually, so you're still into the southern part. It just gives you an idea of how big this country is. You're still getting into sort of just the southern part of the Northwest Territories, and of course it extends beyond the subarctic into the high Arctic and the very northern part of the planet and that. But Wood Buffalo is, as you say, like quite a remote park, and even though there's a road right into Fort Smith and that, not a lot of people make the foray from say southern Canada and get into Wood Buffalo. I think it probably only receives a few thousand visitors each year.
That would have been my guess too. I think it would probably be worth it for anyone who is a real true naturalist who really wants that kind of experience. But for anyone maybe getting on like myself, it might be a little bit too rugged.
Well, it is a park that's hard to, even once you get there, it is a park that's hard to appreciate from just driving around. There are massive rivers there that, if a person could get out on the rivers and get into places like the Delta that are fairly inaccessible, you get a much better overview of the park. But there definitely are areas that you can get to and get a good appreciation of some portions of the park. But overall, it's almost a park that you need to get up in the air and fly around to even get a sense of just how massive it is,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
to be able to see, like herds of bison and large packs of wolves, that type of thing. You can find them on some of the forays you make by road, but it is tough to get an appreciation of the park just from the ground.
Now, all your covers are great, but this one in particular is really striking. You've got the image of the buffalo that isn't immediately seen, like your eye doesn't immediately pick up that that's what it is, and it's really quite striking. Do you have a cover artist that does your covers?
Yeah, so excuse me. Yeah, the that it's interesting that you make that comment about the wood buffalo cover because, I guess because of familiarity, we look at it and we see the buffalo in it right away. But a lot of people have commented that the bison doesn't stand out, and they're really surprised and intrigued when they do see it. All of my covers are actually done by a fellow by the name of Dan Stiles in Portland, Oregon. So it's actually the only thing about my series that isn't Canadian, but Dan actually has done covers for some other well-known Canadian writers.
That's
And
Dan Stiles, and he really is quite a striking artist. Go to georgemercer.com, listeners, and have a look at these covers because they're really quite something to see. I mean, aside from the fact that the stories are really intriguing. Tell me a little bit about Jasper Wild. I think most of our listeners will know Jasper as a park, whereas they may not be familiar with the others you've written about.
yeah, so Jasper Wild is uh, obviously set in Jasper National Park, and Kate and Ben moved to Jasper after being in Wood Buffalo. And in Jasper, the story there that the challenge they face there is that they're up against a proposed development in the national park. Um, a German mining magnate who is sort of pushing a coal mine on the boundaries of the park is actually behind, using that as a bit of a ruse. He's behind a proposal to build a backcountry lodge in one of the premier backcountry valleys in the park, and so their challenge is to basically try and stop that. But it sort of overall speaks to the development pressures that many of our national parks, particularly in southern Canada, face, which um, when I would say is it's actually almost a constant pressure. And even though there are rules and regulations around development, there's always people that want to try to push the edges of that.
Of course, of course. That's what they do, you know. Um, and I think we're all familiar with. On the one hand, the argument is we want to use our resources for our own best benefit, but then on the other hand, our greatest resource of all is these places. And they're just stunningly beautiful. If any of our listeners out there have never been to Canada, I recommend that you do what I did as a young person: get on a train and just go from one end to the other with as many stops as you can make. I met many travelers from, for example, Australia when I was doing that, and seeing our country through other people's eyes is really, it's very revealing because the things that they focus on are these wilderness sites and the great greenery of this country.
Yeah, and that's the other thing about the stories too is trying to really give the readers a sense of place. So that is one of the common comments I get back from people is that they say they really felt like they were in Wood Buffalo National Park. They really felt like they were on the Cabot Trail in Cape Breton Islands or in Jasper National Park. So that's something I really aspire for in my writing, to try and give readers a sense of the places that I'm writing about, and hopefully give them some desire to visit these places or at least learn more about them.
Yes, I would say that would be one of the biggest drivers of all is bring people to these places because they're gorgeous places. They are world-class places, really. Before we talk about Fat Cats, I'll just tell you a little quick story about the Cabot Trail. We lived in Sydney, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia for a little while, and our family, as I'd said earlier, were in New Brunswick on the Bay of Fundy. And we were doing our annual summer jaunt out traveling. We were probably heading down to Vermont and Maine and those places because that would have been a common route for us. And we decided we were coming down. Well, there's no other way to come down except through the Cabot Trail. This would have been probably 73. And of course, the car broke down. We were able to coast down the mountainside to a gas station and pull in. And they called in their local mechanic, who, of course, didn't have parts to fix the car. We ended up pitching the tent, and we were there for 2 weeks, camped on the side of a rock quarry. So our entire holiday was spent camping on the side of the mountain on the Cabot Trail. While they were waiting for a part for the car. It was not the worst holiday we'd ever had either. It was actually kind of nice.
That's a great story.
Mm-hmm. Now tell me a little bit about Fat Cats, because that's a different kind of title again. And we're talking about cougars in this one.
Yeah, so this story is a little different than the others, not dealing with poachers and people trying to kill wildlife necessarily in a national park. But so in this story, my main character switches up a little bit. John Halfcut, who shows up at the tail end of he shows up in the Jasper story, and then at the tail end of that story, moves to the Gulf Islands on Canada's west coast to help establish a new national park here in the southern Gulf Islands. But he's an older warden, a little bit tired of all the bureaucracy. He becomes a little bit of a rogue warden. And because deer are such a huge issue on the islands, and the overpopulation of deer is such a problem because of the lack of predation, any predators like wolves or bears or cougars that show up usually get shot. So John's whole raison d'etre, I guess, is to use cougars to put them out on the islands to help reduce the population of deer.
Mm-hmm.
But he runs into a notorious cougar tracker who is hired by some of the islanders to actually dispatch the cougars. So it's a bit of a challenge between John and this cougar tracker to see who wins out at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And these predatory animals, cougars and wolves, they get such a bad rap internationally. And they've been a hated species, but without them, our ecosystems are just whacked. And I know that island living is particularly challenging with overrun of deer and in some cases moose. I know in Newfoundland, overrun of moose is a real problem. So these kinds of predatory animals are so essential, really, aren't they?
Yeah, and that's that's sort of the underlying ecological theme to the story, is that predation and predators is a huge part of any ecosystem, and in the end they help maintain native biodiversity here on the islands, for example. And even though you're right that predators have had a bad rap for centuries, essentially, I think there is globally a changing perspective on the importance of the role of large predators, and species such as in North America, species such as the various bears, black bears, grizzly bears, and polar bears, cougars and wolves. Increasingly, their importance is being recognized. And then you have things like the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park.
Yes, I saw that video. That was just a stunning video, wasn't it?
Yeah, and all of the spin-off effects ecologically of reintroducing a predator, it basically goes to impacting everything from water and vegetation to songbirds and smaller mammals, right up to larger mammals, like in the case of Yellowstone elk and bison. So basically, it's considered cascading ecological effects, and it really is quite amazing what happens when predators are reintroduced into systems that haven't had them for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because we, being at the top of the food chain, haven't had a respect for these predators, and perhaps have had an underlying fear of them, which in olden days was probably quite natural. I mean, they could do a lot of damage to homesteaders who weren't properly able to take care of themselves against them, but we're not living that life anymore, so I think the fear angle really is kind of irrelevant these days, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, that's a really good point. And I think the other thing is, another point I try to make in the story is, you know, the risk or the perceived risk, that these, predators pose to people. And a friend of mine, a student who worked with me several years ago, made the comment. She was doing her master's on cougars, but she made the comment that we don't think anything of driving down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour or more, separated from oncoming traffic by nothing more than a yellow line of paint. But yet when a predator shows up on the landscape, we cry foul and we worry about it. But so a lot of it has to do with perceived risk and how much risk we're willing to take and how much that risk is actually overblown when we do have predators on the landscape.
That's right. And then, of course, there's the agricultural community that has a voice too, and they're always concerned about predators. But it's all in the balance. And without these guys on the landscape, we really don't have the balance.
Yeah, I mean they're really an essential component of any ecosystem, and also in the context of the West Coast story here. You can say the same thing about species such as orcas or killer whales. As a large predatory mammal in our waters, they play a really critical role, and also the southern resident whales here on the coast are endangered. And so yeah, that's the other part of the story I'm trying to give a perspective on, is that it's not only terrestrial systems but also our marine ecosystems as well are really critical to protect, and that's why there's a big push here on the coast to establish a national marine conservation area and hopefully give some of those species, such as orcas, more protection.
Yeah, yeah. Now the work that you're on right now is outside of the Dyed in the Green series, and it's called Harking. And you've got a tentative release date for 2019. Can you tell us about Harking?
So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I am trying to. I've got other books planned in the series. Hopefully, we'll have 6 or 7 books in the series, but Harking sits outside of it. There are some links, but it's about a young girl, Harking Seawell, who lives in one of the mountain national parks, and basically her interest. She's almost finished high school. She's an avid outdoor person, really interested in mountain biking and hiking and in natural history. But she is challenged to deal with some of her pals from school who are also hardcore mountain bikers, and they end up biking in a closed area within the national park and end up getting charged by a grizzly bear. And through no fault of the bear reacts to their sudden appearance on the trail. But and no one is seriously hurt, but because of that incident, a lot of the parents and some of the members of the public are after the parks to go after the bears and destroy this female bear and her cubs. And Harking takes it upon herself to basically get the true story out and to actually stand up for the bears and try and protect them.
This sounds like a story that really, and all these stories sound like they are equally of interest to adults and young adults, and perhaps even children with a good reading level. Is that true? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think, I basically tell most people who ask me at markets and that the Dyed in the Green series, I would say, like for high school kids and older. And Harking is a little bit of an attempt to maybe get into a little bit of a younger reader group. But definitely, in fact, I do get, and I really love this, I do get a lot of younger people telling me that, they've read books in the Dyed in the Green series and they love them. And so I would have to say that I don't have sort of one demographic that's reading my stories. And, I like to think that people of mostly all ages and, whether male or female are getting, enjoying the stories. And Harking, though, is a little bit of an attempt to try and maybe get a little bit of a younger group, but and also appeal to a younger readership with a story that I think will hopefully entertain them, but also maybe get away from all the stories of wizards and monsters and superheroes. And
Yes, something quite. Well, this is what I was going to say, George, is that the series and Harking They are all quite unique, and which is something that is really to be valued. But having said that, even within this uniqueness, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say I loved Free Willy, and when my oldest was young, he loved Free Willy, and I'm reading about Harking, and I'm getting that same feeling. I know it's not the same kind of story, but I'm getting that kind of feeling. Yes.
Yeah, well, and that's great to hear because I mean that is something that I do want to try and get readers to become emotionally invested in a story like Harking, and in my series, but especially in a story like Harking, to get emotionally invested and sort of understand uh, the impact that we people play on the landscape and how we can affect species such as grizzly bears, and some of the simple things that we can actually do to improve the situation for bears and other species on the landscape while still enjoying them. And but also, yeah, I guess a key message would be about what types of changes to our behavior do we need to make that give these species the space that they need to move around on the landscape and to survive and meet their needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as we are airing on Canada Day weekend, people from all over, I hope, are listening, not just within Canada. But if you're within Canada, please go to georgemercer.com and look these books up, because my sense is that these are treasures for us. And, please share these works widely with your friends outside of Canada to give them a better sense of what our country is about. You can follow George Mercer on Twitter too. What's your Twitter handle?
It's at George Mercer, basically. Yeah, that's my main one. So you can follow me on Twitter at George Mercer.
Mm-hmm. And are you also on Facebook?
I'm on Facebook. I don't. I think if people just search for my name, George Mercer, I think
they're gonna find you. Yeah.
They'll find me.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, George. I really appreciated having you on and talking about your works. They really look like fine works to my eye, and I'm going to be investigating them further, and I'm really encouraging readers out there to please investigate these works. I want to send a heartfelt thanks to George Mercer, author and former parks warden, for joining us today on Dead to Rights, the podcast. A very happy Canada Day to all our Canuckian listeners, and a happy 4th of July to our American friends. You can find Dead to Rights at deadtorights.ca or at our Facebook page. Our Twitter handle is at deadtorightspod. We'd love to hear from you at carrickpublishing.com or at our Carrick Publishing Facebook page, and we certainly welcome any suggestions regarding authors to be interviewed. You can find me, Donna Carrick, at Donna_Carrick, or at my website, donnacarrick.com. You can find my partner in crime, Alec Carrick, at Twitter at Alex_Carrick, or at his website, alexcarrick.com. Join us next week when we speak with self-help author Irene Weichler, the author of Role Reversal. All Dead to Rights interviews, stories, and comments are property of Carrick Publishing. All production is handled by Donna Carrick. Our Dead to Rights theme song is Eyes of Gold, composed and performed by Ted Carrick, who also brought us the original story scoring music. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
A dusty road, man alone. His vital signs go on hold. And I don't know what you've been told, but the years have turned my eyes gold. And I I told you what you told me. We'd never be in the same boat for free. Yet it rides. Let it rock.